Security, get him out now. 39 seconds later, a $100 million empire lay in ruins, and America's most powerful prosperity preacher stood speechless before 10,000 witnesses who finally learned the truth. The Crystal Cathedral spotlights blazed down like the judgment seat of heaven itself, as Joyce Meyer commanded her golden stage, diamond jewelry catching the light like stars in a manufactured paradise. Her voice boomed through million-dollar speakers. God wants you rich. 10,000 desperate souls reached for their wallets, ready to charge hope they couldn't afford to her altar of greed. But 50 feet away in the cathedral's shadows sat the most dangerous man in America. Senator John Kennedy clutched a worn leather briefcase containing documents that would expose fraud so massive, so calculated, so evil that it would make Bernie Madoff look like a street pickpocket. The prosperity preacher who'd stolen $23.8 million from widows and disabled veterans was about to meet Louisiana justice, and she had no idea what was coming. Smash that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness isn't just the takedown of one fraud, it's the moment America finally fought back against religious predators who feast on faith. March 18, 2024, the Breakthrough to Prosperity Conference in St. Louis drew the biggest crowd in Christian television history. Joyce Meyer Ministries had spent $2.3 million promoting the event, promising attendees they'd learn God's secrets to supernatural wealth. But what they didn't know was that every dollar spent on advertising had been tracked, traced, and documented by Kennedy's Senate Oversight Committee. The arena's opulent setup screamed of excess. Golden podiums, crystal fountains, VIP sections for donors who'd given 6 figures or more. Meyer herself appeared in a $15,000 designer dress, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her smile as bright and artificial as the stadium lights. She wore a diamond cross worth more than most Americans' annual salary. A symbol of faith transformed into a monument to greed. Kennedy sat in Section C, Row 12, Seat 8, carefully chosen to be close enough to be heard but far enough to avoid early detection. His gray suit was wrinkled from the flight. His shoes had seen better decades. His leather briefcase looked like it had survived the Civil War. To the security team scanning the crowd, he appeared to be just another curious politician attending a religious event. They had no idea he'd spent 4 months building the most devastating case against religious fraud in American history. Tonight, Meyer's voice thundered across the arena, "We're going to break the spirit of poverty over your life forever." The crowd roared approval. Hands reached skyward. Credit cards emerged from purses and wallets as donation envelopes were passed down every row. Meyer paced the stage like a lioness hunting prey. "Some of you drove here in broken-down cars because you've been believing the devil's lie that God wants you poor. But I'm here to tell you, poverty is a curse, and prosperity is your birthright." The crowd erupted again. In the VIP section, men in $1,000 suits nodded approvingly. These were Meyer's biggest contributors, businessmen who donated millions in exchange for private meetings, exclusive dinners, and the false promise of divine favor in their business dealings. But Kennedy's investigation had revealed the truth about Meyer's inner circle: shell companies, money laundering, kickback schemes that made congressional corruption look like jaywalking. The briefcase beside his feet contained bank records, emails, and recorded phone calls that would destroy not just Meyer, but dozens of prosperity preachers across America. Meyer continued her pitch, her voice rising to a hypnotic crescendo. "The Lord told me personally that someone in this arena tonight is going to sow a $10,000 seed offering and receive a $1 million breakthrough within 90 days. Hands shot up across the arena as desperate believers competed to bankrupt themselves for false hope. A elderly woman in the front row began pulling $100 bills from an envelope, her Social Security check, Kennedy realized, recognizing the government-issued envelope from his own district office. That's when he'd seen enough. Kennedy stood up slowly, deliberately. His movement was subtle at first, but something about his posture, the straight back, the calm confidence, the absolute stillness of a predator about to strike, caught the attention of Meyer's security team. "Ma'am," Kennedy called out, his Louisiana drawl cutting through the arena's hum like a razor through silk. "I have a question about biblical stewardship." But Meyer had no idea she was about to walk into a trap 4 months in the making. The arena fell silent. 10,000 heads turned to see the gray-haired man in the rumpled suit standing calmly in the middle section, his hands folded, his expression pleasant but unreadable. Meyer's smile flickered for just a moment before snapping back into place with practiced precision. She'd handled hostile questions before. Politicians, reporters, angry ex-donors. This would be no different. "Well, Senator Kennedy," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that had made her rich, "I appreciate your interest, but I'm not sure a politician understands the spiritual principles of kingdom finances." The crowd chuckled nervously. A few people clapped. But something in Kennedy's stillness, the way he didn't react to her dismissal, sent a ripple of unease through the arena. Kennedy reached down and picked up his briefcase. The simple motion seemed to echo in the sudden quiet, leather creaking like old wood under pressure. "Ma'am," Kennedy said, his voice carrying easily across the arena without amplification, "I understand finance just fine. I also understand scripture. And I'm mighty curious how you reconcile Jesus telling the rich young ruler to sell everything and give to the poor with your personal ownership of 4 private jets." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. This wasn't the polite questioning Meyer was used to. This was precision-guided artillery aimed at the heart of her prosperity doctrine. Meyer's face flushed red. Her hands gripped the golden podium until her knuckles turned white. "Senator Kennedy, you're out of order. This is a house of worship, not a Senate hearing room." Kennedy opened his briefcase with deliberate calm, the clicking sound amplified by the arena's acoustics. "Mrs. Meyer, this isn't about politics. This is about the Bible. Matthew 6:19 says, 'Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth.' How does that square with your net worth of $25 million? The number hit the crowd like a physical blow. $25 million. Many of the people in the arena lived paycheck to paycheck, sending their grocery money to Meyer's ministry because she'd promised God would multiply it back to them. Meyer's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Her voice rose to a near shriek. "Security! This man is disrupting our worship service." 2 massive security guards started moving down the aisle toward Kennedy, but he held up a single sheet of paper from his briefcase, and somehow that simple gesture stopped them in their tracks. "Before your people escort me out," Kennedy said, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute authority, "would you mind explaining to these good folks why your ministry spent $4.2 million on luxury homes while asking widows to send in their Social Security checks?" The arena erupted. Shouts of confusion and anger filled the air. Some people stood up, demanding answers. Others began walking toward the exits, finally understanding they'd been played. But Kennedy wasn't finished. He'd spent 4 months preparing for this moment, and 39 seconds wasn't nearly enough time to expose the full scope of Meyer's criminal enterprise. What happened next would be replayed millions of times and destroy the prosperity gospel forever. Meyer's voice cracked as she tried to regain control of the spiraling situation. Her face was now bright red, her perfectly applied makeup beginning to run under the hot stage lights. The crowd's mood had shifted from worship to something much more dangerous. The anger of believers who'd finally realized they'd been systematically robbed. "Shut your mouth," Meyer screamed into her microphone, the words echoing across the arena like a thunderclap. "Just shut your mouth and get out of God's house before I have you arrested for trespassing." The words hung in the air like a curse. 10,000 people fell silent, processing what they'd just witnessed. America's most prominent female preacher had just told a United States senator to shut his mouth in the middle of what was supposed to be a Christian worship service. Kennedy stood perfectly still for exactly 3 seconds. The arena held its collective breath. Then, with a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, he spoke the words that would end Joyce Meyer's career and shake American Christianity to its foundation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft but somehow carrying to every corner of the massive arena, "I've been called many things in my time, but I've never been told to shut my mouth by someone who claims to represent Jesus Christ." He held up a single document from his briefcase, the paper clearly visible to the dozens of cameras recording every moment. "This is a bank statement from your personal account showing a $2.8 million deposit from ministry funds, made the same week you sent letters to your supporters saying the ministry was facing bankruptcy and asking them to give sacrificially to keep your television program on the air." The crowd exploded. Shouts of outrage and disbelief filled the arena as 10,000 people processed the implications of what they'd just heard. Several dozen followers immediately began walking toward the exits. Others stood up shouting questions at Meyer, demanding explanations she couldn't give. Kennedy's voice cut through the chaos with surgical precision. "You told these good people to trust God and send in their rent money because He would multiply it back to them. But God didn't multiply it back, did He, ma'am? You multiplied it back directly into your personal bank account." Meyer stood frozen behind her golden podium, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Her security team had stopped moving, apparently as stunned by the revelations as everyone else in the arena. Kennedy reached into his briefcase again, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "And this document shows your ministry purchased a $47,000 toilet for one of your private jets, while your followers were eating ramen noodles because they donated their food money to your seed offering campaigns." The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Boos and shouts of fraud filled the air as thousands of people realized they'd been systematically manipulated by someone they'd trusted with their faith and their life savings. But Kennedy wasn't finished. The briefcase still contained documents that would expose not just Meyer, but the entire prosperity gospel industrial complex that had stolen billions from desperate Americans. Comment below if you think religious fraud should be a federal crime. Kennedy reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a thick stack of papers bound with a red ribbon. The simple gesture somehow commanded more attention than all of Meyer's theatrical productions combined. "These are letters, Mrs. Meyer," Kennedy said, his voice now carrying the moral weight of a biblical prophet. "Letters from your followers, people whose lives you've destroyed with your false promises. Would you like me to read a few?" He didn't wait for permission. Margaret Thompson from Tulsa writes, "I gave my last $500 to Joyce Meyer's ministry because she promised God would bless me double. That was 8 months ago. I've been evicted from my apartment and I'm now living in my car. My diabetes medication costs $300 a month and I can't afford it. Please help me understand why God hasn't kept his promise." A woman in the front row began crying. Others looked away, recognizing their own stories in Margaret's desperate words. Kennedy's voice remained steady, but somehow carried more emotional weight than Meyer's theatrical performance ever had. Robert Martinez from Phoenix writes, "I'm a disabled veteran living on $1,200 a month. Joyce Meyer said if I sowed my entire disability check as a seed offering, God would heal my legs and restore my finances. I've been in a wheelchair for 3 years since an IED explosion in Iraq. I gave her my entire check for 6 months straight. I had to choose between my medication and food. My legs are still paralyzed, and now I can't pay rent. Please tell me when God's promise will come true." The arena was now completely silent, except for the sound of people crying. Meyer's security team stood frozen, apparently unable to process what they were hearing. Kennedy looked directly at Meyer, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. "And this one's from Sarah Williams, age 73, from right here in Missouri. Dear Senator, I watched Joyce Meyer on television every day for 10 years. She said God told her personally that anyone who sent $1,000 would receive supernatural financial breakthrough. I sent her my entire life savings, mined $4 from my late husband's insurance policy. That was 2 years ago. I now work at Walmart 30 hours a week at age 73 because I can't afford to eat. Joyce Meyer bought another mansion, but God never sent my breakthrough. Please help me understand why." A man in the VIP section stood up and began walking toward the exit, his face pale with shame. Then another. Then dozens more as Meyer's biggest contributors realized they'd been complicit in a massive fraud. Kennedy's voice rose for the first time, filled with the righteous anger of someone who'd spent months documenting human suffering on an industrial scale. "Meyer, while you were buying $47,000 toilets and $2.8 million mansions, Sarah Williams was eating cat food because she'd given you her dead husband's insurance money, based on your promise that God would multiply it back. While you were flying in private jets that cost more per hour to operate than most families earn in a year, Robert Martinez was choosing between his pain medication and food because he'd given you his disability check." The arena erupted again, but this time it wasn't confusion or anger. It was the sound of 10,000 people finally understanding they'd been victims of the most sophisticated religious con game in American history. Meyer tried one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Those letters are fake," she screamed into her microphone. "This is a political attack on Christianity." Kennedy's smile was sad but determined. He reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a small digital recorder. "Mrs. Meyer, these letters aren't fake, and neither is this." The recording that played next would destroy not just Joyce Meyer, but the entire prosperity gospel movement. Kennedy pressed play on the digital recorder, and Joyce Meyer's own voice filled the arena, caught on a secretly recorded phone call from her private office just 3 weeks earlier. "Listen, Carol." Meyer's voice crackled through the sound system, clear as a bell. "These people are idiots. They'll literally send us their rent money if we just quote the right Bible verses. I made $3.2 million just last month from the Supernatural Breakthrough campaign. The key is to make them feel guilty if they don't give. Tell them their lack of faith is blocking God's blessing." The arena fell into a silence so complete you could hear the air conditioning humming. 10,000 people stared at Meyer in absolute shock as her own words condemned her. The recording continued. Meyer's voice now sounding like nails on a chalkboard to the people who'd trusted her with their faith and finances. The best part is they never complain when the breakthrough doesn't come. They just blame themselves and send more money. I told one woman God showed me she needed to sow her entire Social Security check for 3 months straight. She actually did it. Can you believe these people? Laughter could be heard on the recording. Meyer and her assistant laughing at the woman who'd starved herself to fund Meyer's luxury lifestyle. The widow letters are pure gold. Nothing motivates giving like a good sob story about dead husbands and empty bank accounts. I've got a whole template now. God told me personally that you need to sow through your pain. Works every time. The recording ended, and the silence that followed was deafening. Meyer stood behind her podium, her face completely drained of color, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. For the first time in her career, Joyce Meyer was speechless. Kennedy stepped forward slightly, his voice cutting through the silence like a sword through flesh. Mrs. Meyer, that recording was made by a whistleblower in your organization who couldn't stomach watching you rob desperate people anymore. It's been verified by FBI forensics experts and will be entered as evidence in the federal investigation that begins tomorrow morning. The crowd erupted into chaos. People screaming, others crying, security guards looking confused and overwhelmed as thousands of people began demanding refunds, explanations, and justice. But Kennedy raised his hand, and somehow his simple gesture commanded attention even in the midst of the chaos. "Folks," he said, his Louisiana drawl now carrying the authority of both a United States Senator and an Old Testament prophet, "you've been hurt tonight. You've learned some hard truths about someone you trusted. But I want you to know that real Christianity, the kind Jesus actually taught, has nothing to do with what you've seen here." He held up his worn leather Bible, its pages marked with years of study and prayer. Jesus never promised you a mansion. He never said faith would make you rich. What he did promise was that he'd never leave you or forsake you, that he'd provide for your needs, not your greed, and that real treasure comes from serving others, not exploiting them. The crowd had grown quiet again, hanging on every word from the man who'd just exposed the fraud they'd been living under. The gospel isn't about sending money to televangelists who fly in private jets. It's about loving your neighbor, caring for the